Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Hello, and welcome to Then and Now. I'm Ben Zdencanovic, the host of this week's episode. Between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, Louisiana, lies a 100-mile stretch along the Mississippi River known for its concentration of chemical plants, hazardous waste sites, and prisons. Nicknamed Cancer Alley, this region has some of the highest rates of pollution-linked illnesses in the country. Here to discuss the unique history and policy challenges of this region of Southeast Louisiana is Jennifer Klein, the Bradford Durfee Professor of History at Yale University. A leading authority on U.S. labor history, urban history, social movements, and political economy, Klein is the author of For All These Rights, Business, Labor, and the Shaping of America's Public-Private Welfare State, published by Princeton University Press in 2003. And she's the co-author with Eileen Boris of Caring for America, Home Health Workers in the Shadow of the Welfare State, published by Oxford University Press in 2012. She is currently working on a new book, tentatively entitled Wastelands, The Social Geography of Capitalism, Coerced Labor, and Marginalization in Louisiana's Mississippi River Valley. Jennifer Klein, welcome to Then and Now.
Hi, it's good to see you. Good to be here.
So your project focuses on the east and west banks of the Mississippi River, from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. Can you start off by just kind of describing this area? What does it look like today? What are some social and environmental challenges that it faces? And why is this area important?
So the Mississippi, which, flows all the way from the border of Canada through the United States, one of the largest river systems in the world, when it hits Baton Rouge, becomes very windy, very bendy, till it gets down into the Delta and flushes out into the Gulf of Mexico. And this is one of the most fertile river valleys where sugar has been planted for a couple of centuries. And then chemical plants moved in after World War II. You also have petroleum refining, gas pipelines. So picture it as an area that had been a floodplain, had been really lush marshes and swamps, but now has over 150 chemical plants and refineries and hundreds of miles of pipeline going through it. And so this lush area has become quite desiccated in terms of the vegetation. There are areas in which the wildlife has just been wiped out. The fish have been poisoned. In fact, the Mississippi is at such a low level now. Little islands are kind of popping up in it. And it's an area that has now come to be known by two other names. One is the Chemical Corridor, and the other is Cancer Alley. So what was a slave area, a plantation area, is now today known as a deep ecological and public health threat.
And your historical investigation of this area begins with the 18th century, with French settlements in the region. So, can you walk us through the early history of this area before the Civil War?
Right. So the French, I mean, they first started coming through just guided on boats by, of course, different Native Americans in the late 17th century, but really tried to establish a colony there in the early 18th century. So around 1720 is when New Orleans was first marked out. But, the Mississippi regularly floods. That's the natural path of the river. So there's constantly the river washing over. There's a bit of high ground on the banks of the river, but after that, it flows into swamp and marsh. And so what the French did is they couldn't really attract any colonists to settle in the middle of swamp forest. And so what they did was they brought convicts over, including female convicts from France, who were banished in perpetuity to help tame the river and the land. And they also enslaved the various Native American tribes in the area. Tribes had lived very successfully, with a lot of prosperity and health in the bends of the river, and the French, were in constant battle with them and pushed them out, and used slaves to try to make a go of it. Now, the first thing they thought they could do was make this colony into a tobacco growing area like Virginia. They figured, oh, well, the British have done this in the Chesapeake. We can create tobacco, this new coveted product in Europe. But it turns out tobacco needs dry land. And Mississippi River banks and Louisiana were definitely not dry land. By the mid to late 18th century, they decided to try indigo. They also could not make indigo work. And so it's not until the end of the 18th century that they finally came up with a product that could be grown on a large scale and exported to Europe. And that was sugar.
And after the Civil War, you write that this area has quite a colorful history. It was the home to a leper colony, several prisons, juvenile detention centers. So what can this tell us about the long history of carcerality in the region? And how did that intersect with racial domination and Jim Crow after the Civil War?
Okay, so to just connect our kind of 18th century story with the 19th century, once the French realized they could really grow sugar successfully in the wetlands, then they really turned to bringing in African slaves. And so that whole stretch of the Mississippi, really from Baton Rouge down to the Delta and the end of the river, was sugar country. A couple of things are important about that. First of all, sugar required a lot of slaves. So really, these were the largest slave-owning plantations in that whole River Valley area. They also were the richest plantation owners, the most concentrated wealth. But sugar, to some degree, is also a kind of industrial produced commodity, because as soon as you harvest it, it has to be milled. So there's also a big capital investment in sugar mills that slaves also had to work in, but it's also skilled labor. So they had some leverage. But when the Union Army came through, they realized, this is what sustains these plantation owners in the Louisiana area. And so the Union Army burned down a lot of sugar mills and deliberately went after the sugar plantations. So by the late 19th century, a lot of these sugar plantations were non-functioning or even abandoned, because it did take a huge amount of capital to get them going again. So two things I think result from this. One is that those African Americans who worked in sugar mills had a skill, and they could negotiate during Reconstruction for wages. So as long as the federal government was there, this actually, enabled them to become wage workers rather than sharecroppers. But the other thing it meant was there's a lot of abandoned land. So two things happen. One, carceral institutions moved on to these abandoned sugar plantations. So Angola, which really became the first Louisiana state penitentiary, moved on to an abandoned sugar plantation. The psychiatric hospital, which in the 19th century was referred to as the asylum, moved on to it. And then also another penitentiary site in St. Gabriel for African American slaves. And finally, a leprosy hospital was opened in the 1890s on a former sugar plantation. And when the patients were first sent out there from New Orleans, they had to live in the slave quarters while the nuns who took care of them lived in the manor house. So really what it set up was yet a new phase of expulsion, confinement, and coercion. Not only were the inmates forced to, of course, stay and work in the fields in the penitentiary, but the patients in the so-called asylum and the leprosy hospital were confined there indefinitely. They're sentenced. The patients had their names taken away from them. They had to cut off contact with their family. They had to cut off contact with their community, and they pretty much remained there for the rest of their adult lives. So now we're kind of moving into a second pattern of coercion, of marginalization, of waste. And it's not as though anybody was going to be treated in this hospital. They were simply pushed out to a place where they could be confined. The other thing is that it's important to note that in Louisiana, there was actually radical Reconstruction, which meant that freed slaves, African Americans, were given land. And there were also free towns that had been either longstanding communities of free Blacks or freedmen's towns that were established when Blacks were given land. So what emerged from the Civil War was a kind of checkerboard pattern of large white plantation, small Black freeholding, large white plantation, small Black free town. That would matter starting in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, when first the oil industry came in and the chemical industry then came, because it's the white plantations that would sell out to the oil or the chemical companies, but African Americans held on to their land, or the free town stayed there. So the free town ends up being right on the fence line of the refinery or the chemical plant, but no Blacks could ever get jobs there. So it perpetuates now segregation.
Tell us more about these this growing chemical and petrochemical industrial landscape in this area after World War II. How did that become enmeshed with this carceral landscape that you've described? And how did this new industrial economy reshape the region socially, economically, and environmentally?
So, when the French divided the land into plantations, they used them as long strips from the river to the back swamp, or pants. So each plantation owner would get a slice of the river, some high levee, some low ground to plant in, and the back swamp. And so when the carceral institutions were moved in there, that means that the St. Gabriel prison plantation was pretty much right on the river. 8 miles down the road was the Carville Leprosy Hospital, which after 1920 would become known as a U.S. public health service for Hansen's disease hospital. But that's also right on the river. A few miles up from that were new juvenile correctional institutions in Angola. But when the chemical companies started to arrive, they also want to be on the river. And they, too, take over plantations. So they're still in the same mold. And Louisiana engaged in really aggressive recruitment of companies from up north. And they had three key ways in which they would attract these companies. One, they would offer total tax exemption on corporate property tax and ad valorem tax. So if you move to Louisiana, no matter how profitable your company is, you will not have to pay taxes. So Monsanto, Shell, DuPont, all these incredibly prosperous, successful major companies that moved into Louisiana were given total multi-million-dollar tax breaks for 10 years, extendable into perpetuity. The next thing is they promised, quote, a friendly labor supply. That is probably non-union and low wage and little regulation. And the third thing is as much water as they wanted or needed to use. So the companies really moved in believing the Mississippi River and bayous were just an unlimited source. They could take as much water out of them as they wanted, and it can dump any amount of wastewater and chemical into it because those alluvial marshes and the currents of the river would just wash it out to the ocean. So management consulting firms really encourage them to see people, the landscape and water as cheap and available resources. And so the chemical industry spreads from the 1940s into the 60s, and it circles around these growing prisons because you get even more opening up. A new Louisiana Correctional Institute for women opened in the 1970s. A male prison, the Elaine Hunt Correctional Facility, opened up right there in the, just right next door. More juvenile prisons were built up in East Baton Rouge, and they are becoming encircled by chemical plants, pipelines running right across the prison yard. All of these are backed up right next to those traditional African-American free towns. And it's Louisiana, so nothing is regulated. So there were constant emissions, explosions, and leakages, and no one to track it. So it's not only that the companies had prerogative over siting, over labor, but they really have prerogative kind of over the whole physical, ecological landscape itself.
And a big part of your story is resistance to these intertwined systems, from grassroots organizing, from environmental justice groups and labor unions. So what can we learn from these struggles of resistance?
Yeah, well, because there really was no oversight, and also because these rural parishes really lacked the ability to in any way control siting or tax the companies to try to build modern water systems, by the early 70s, there is a just vast toxic mess all around and through these rural parishes, which affected African-American residents and white residents. And it was the case through rural areas as well as urban areas in East Baton Rouge. So actually, by the 1970s, you started to get groups really in the rural parishes, both white and Black residents, who were organizing against the explosions, against the kind of chemical dumping they could see happening in their bayous where they could no longer fish or hunt. And because they could see that the state government was so tightly in league with the industry, they actually start going to the federal government. So we're often told that, oh, well, you see, people in places like Louisiana, they're so conservative, they're so anti-statist, and it's because, they believe in, quote, traditional values, or they are evangelical Christians, and therefore they're always anti-statist. But if you actually go back and look, in the 1970s, they are writing to their federal Congress people. They're writing to different agencies in the federal government, and they are desperately trying to get the state to intervene and help them. And so after 1970, once the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, came into existence, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, then actually people on the ground really had a partner in the federal government whom they could go to help them confront the growing toxicity of their air, their water. It was affecting their animals as well as their families. The land was degrading around them. And so they were actually very eager to learn from both environmental and public health experts in the federal government about how they could challenge the prerogative these companies seem to have over the whole the geographical landscape of that area. And the other thing is that in the 1950s and 60s, the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, OCAW, really did start making gains. They're organizing kind of small shops, small groups of workers at a time. But the fact is that they were managing to unionize the plants. Of course, this perpetuates a racial differential once again, because it's mainly white workers who had jobs in the plants and Black workers who were living in the shadow of the smokestack. But OCAW was a really unique union. It was the union that led the fight to pass OSHA. It was a union that wanted to work closely with EPA. And so the OCAW union also became really involved in the 1970s in trying to bring in those two agencies to help them figure out what kind of chemicals are we working with? What are the effects of these chemicals? What are the effects on worker safety? But that also means the community. And so at that time, you really had a union that understood collective bargaining couldn't just be about negotiating for higher wages or their own internal benefits. It was going to have to deal with inside and outside the plant. And so we also gain a different picture, I think, about labor history when we look at this scenario, because what you're able to see is, all right, the union's making gains, they're managed to organize shops, and it's not until the mid-70s that the chemical plants really start to turn aggressively against them and on the offensive. And in some ways, that fits a typical narrative. But when you look closely at what was unique about this union in this place, here's what you see is, as long as this fight was over, 50 cents more an hour or $1 more an hour, as long as it was just over these, wage issues, that was tolerable. But once the union got involved in trying to find out what the chemicals were, trying to do the research on their health impacts, getting these chemicals classified as carcinogens, they were interfering with the most fundamental aspects of production. And that's when management turns against them. When they start asking for health data from inside the plant, that's when management turns against them. So we see a huge grassroots story through the 70s and even into the 80s, when both the community groups and the union, for the first time, won a Department of Environmental Quality at the state level that, again, they could use to investigate the toxicity coming out of these plants. So then the big question becomes, all right, if they were able to be allies, what broke them up? It's not that these people are anti-statist or they love the industry, they don't care. They're really they're really upset. So the question becomes, how does power get turned against them? Because it's also in the 1980s that Tulane and other schools of public health start doing the studies of cancer and finding cancer clusters. In St. Gabriel, where you had the women's prison and the Hansen's Disease Hospital and 15 plants surrounding them, they did an extensive miscarriage study and found miscarriages. So the health information and the ecological damage is getting out.
And lastly, Jennifer, what can this story of waste and how capitalism produces both social and environmental waste and resistance to those processes, how can that inform the ways that we think about policy today, both in this region and maybe more broadly? What are some lessons from the past for our present intertwined crises of environmental degradation, mass incarceration, and inequality?
Well, it's interesting because we might look at Louisiana and see, okay, it has one phase of capitalism that was sugar plantations based on slavery. We had a next round of capitalist development that was oil and chemicals and petrochemicals. But there's also a third stage that comes along, which is the new hazardous waste industry. So we get the emergence of a new company like Rollins or Browning Ferris Industries, BFI, that become entrepreneurs of waste. And this becomes huge business. By the 1980s, those two companies are publicly traded companies. They are big winners on Wall Street. And on the surface, they're playing by the rules, processing waste through these facilities, but they're also constantly dumping it in the bayous, in the swamps, in the river. They become a really important player. And so they also become companies that begin to box out the federal government and trade on their favors with the state. Also, what's growing during the 1970s and the 80s is, as you say, mass incarceration. So the incarceration levels were going up so high that Louisiana, by the end of the century, had the greatest rate of incarceration in the nation. Those inmates were still doing forced labor. At Angola and elsewhere, they're still cultivating sugar. They're still milling sugar. In the women's prison, they're having to work in a garment factory. In the men's prison, there's a chemical plant making cleaners and scouring powders. The juvenile prisons are also doing forced labor. So they're doing forced labor, but now they're doing it in an incredibly toxic environment and with longer sentences, spending more time amid that toxicity. So it increases what I would call carceral insecurity and even more damage to their health. And Louisiana, because it's not taking in any taxes from those companies, the only way that it's going to pay for such levels of mass incarceration is by more forced labor among the workers. So we're seeing a cycle then of expulsion, confinement, forced labor, and contamination. So what can we learn from this? First of all, there have got to be union and community alliances, because the only way to deal with chemical company prerogative over health and environmental damage is both inside the plant and outside the plant. Secondly, we now have a continuum, I think as America has always had, but of what is considered free and unfree labor, because the people in the prison are doing related labor. Then now we have things like work furloughs, work release, where they stay in the area in the toxicity, but continue to do labor. There's now like parole, which keeps you fixed in place. So there's all these ways in which people are being trapped within the shadow of the smokestack, right? And one of the things, the biggest takeaways from the OCAW story, I think, is they ran a campaign called The Right to Know, which said, if we're working with chemicals, we have a right to know what those are. If we're doing work that damages health, we have a right to that data. And we have a right to try to use collective bargaining to determine what are the safety features, what are the safety procedures, what is going to be considered good health, again, in the community as well as in the plant. And COVID showed us that we have to get back to that we can't rely on managers to call the shots on what is safe production and what is health and what we're entitled to in terms of health, that we have to be pushing for workers' committees that are part of setting the health and safety procedures inside the workplace, but we also have to be connecting those to our control over the natural resources around us, that animals, environment, air, water, and humans are going to be equally damaged unless we have democratic control over that whole web of life.
Jennifer Klein of Yale University, thank you so much for joining Then and Now.
I'm glad I had a chance to talk about this history, and we have a lot of stake right now. So I hope we'll all, figure out how we're going to rebuild our natural environments and our safe workplaces.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.